Okay, so you are who and what do you kind of do in the D&D community?
Hi, my name is Jonathan Connor Stowe. He, him, you can call me Connor. And I'm pretty active in the D&D community, in both in the creative sphere and in the public sphere. So creative sphere means creating content for people who enjoy the game to play through, read, and assimilate into their games, either at home or in public. The public sphere is uh, playing D&D out in public, putting a public face on it. And for me, that includes doing public events like conventions where thousands of people come together to play. It also includes my charity work because I'm the founder and president of D8 Summit Charities. We're a 501c3, and our focus is on bringing charity offerings into those public play events.
Yeah, and we met, I think, initially at, I believe, Winter Fantasy, or
It might have been Gamehole Con.
maybe, probably. I went to so many conventions in that convention circuit year that it was so nuts.
Yeah, winter fantasy has always been tough for me because they offer it in the middle of the winter, but unfortunately, I'm a public school employee. That's not unfortunately, but it means unfortunately I don't have the free time to attend as many events as I would like to.
Right, which is something I'm going to encounter when I go into grad school, because I know that's a thing as well. It's like I was like, conventions.
They choose your schedule. You don't get to take vacations. You take them when you're given them.
Yeah. So as I kind of mentioned before, this is an activism project for my Women and Gender Studies class. I'm going to be doing the interview today over representation, diversity, women, and LGBTQ plus issues in D&D, which is something that I feel we both kind of know about and are passionate about. So my first initial question here is, what does diversity and representation of women and LGBTQ plus in D&D mean to you? And do you feel that these things matter?
So I will start with the easy question. The easy part of that question: does representation of women and L plus people in gaming, does that matter? Yes, immensely. Um, I'm a big believer in opening up spaces in public to people who have often felt unwelcomed by them in the past. Um, Dungeons and Dragons as a hobby goes back to the 70s, to the early 70s in particular, and at least since the mid 80s, it's been heavily dominated by men, particularly cis straight men, particularly white cis straight men. And so, and ultimately those spaces, since I'm so interested in public spaces for Dungeons and Dragons, creating communities where anybody that wants to come out and enjoy the game is important to me. And so a lot of my work has been in telling stories that are diverse. It has been so that people see themselves in my stories. It's in creating spaces where individuals who aren't in that majority voice can feel welcome and safe. And so that's important as well. I open disclosure, I am a cis man. I am a mixed race, queer cis man, but I am a cis man, and I work very hard to be sensitive to all issues of minority, even those that don't touch me. Um, and so I try to work my knowledge of what I do in my profession, which is counseling and education. I try to work that into those spaces as well to create those safe spaces. Ultimately, with the hopes of educating and uniting the community, but when it comes down to it, part of it's also forcing some of those nastier elements that aren't willing to be open and accepting and affirming to get those nasty elements out of our community.
Yeah. And then you kind of touched on it a little bit, but what are those kind of uh what do those two topics kind of mean to you in the literal meaning of like the definition and then like personal meaningfulness of diversity and representation?
So diversity and representation, my understanding of its meaning is to or, to not only privately but publicly put forward a representation of in our spaces that are a cross section of our actual community. So D&D is a subculture, a subculture phenomenon, subculture activity. But I would know that diversity and acceptance is happening if I took a bunch of players from that subculture and with no other context stood them next to a cross section of wider culture if they look similar. And so that's, at least to me, that's what it looks like in presentation. Now privately, it's a little bit of a different matter. For me, creating open and loving spaces are an incredibly important thing. And I go back constantly to the concepts of love and compassion in most things that I do. And I try very hard to live that belief set. And diversity and representation is actively showing love, because anytime that you create a space where somebody feels like they belong, you're putting a little bit more of that out into the world. So making that societal shift means opening up our culture, opening up our spaces to places where people feel loved and connected. And anybody who has done research into those concepts know that feeling love and feeling connected is a critical part of health, just in general. So that's why when I talk about that, why it's so personal, that's why it's personal. It's personal because it's health. It's personal because it's well-being, and it's personal because when you genuinely just want the best for other people, what you do. So yeah, I'm willing to go out there that way.
Yeah. So um I'll just keep going in order. So in published official content being like the actual hardcover Wizards of the Coast adventures, resources, as well as AL content, which is something that we do at conventions, do you feel there's enough representation?
No, I don't. If you ask me yes or no, I do not. Do I feel like it's getting better? Yes. But getting better isn't the same as being enough. And if I were to take personalities from the stories and array them out, I think you would, notice, like I was describing earlier, if I took pictures of people, and put them next to a wider picture of our society, they wouldn't line up. They wouldn't be the same. It is getting better. And the way that it gets better is because there are people, not just me, but there are many people out there who are working hard to include diverse representations in their stories. And there are people in the decision-making capacity in our community that are making the effort to bring on people to write these stories that are also more diverse. The people writing are more diverse and representative as well. So both of those things working in tandem, I think we'll eventually get there, but we're not there yet, I'm sorry to say.
No, and I personally feel the same way. I remember when Waterdeep Dragon Heist came out, and that
Mhm.
is one of the select few book adventures I've actually ran. Um, and when I was running that for one of my school groups that I had, I was so excited when I was reading the section where they get the tavern and then there's that entire little city block that they
That's pretty
have.
cool. Mhm.
Mhm. And there's all the different characters they can have. And then there was they never say specifically, but the Eladrin. Eladrin by nature are more non-binary or gender non-conforming. So one of the character in that chapter that was Eladrin was a they slash them. That made me very excited. And then I believe it was the smith slash woodworking shop. I believe
The,
they were a gay couple.
the armor smith and the weapon
Yes.
crafter, yes, they were a gay couple.
Yes, and I saw that and that made me really, really excited. I unfortunately have just not had the time to read, like Mad Mage or any of the adventures that have come out since, which is now, oh, I think like almost 2 years. But, um, I saw that and I knew that kind of meant a step in the right direction.
Mhm.
Eladrin in general being, more they slash them gender non-conforming entities was a kind of step in the right direction. I remember seeing something on DM's Guild, which isn't official content, which, well, it's not like AL official or Wizards of the Coast, but I still recognize it as,
Mhm.
it's the creator community. I still think it's D&D content, but I
It
remember
is.
the Uncaged anthology or
Mhm.
collection.
Mhm.
I know Lisa Penrose was kind of really like championing that and like promoting that a lot, and it was a lot of women and like I believe there was like trans representation and stuff like that. It was a very representative
Mhm.
collection. I never got to read it personally yet, but I know that that was like a good one at the time as well.
Yeah, and it still holds up. The whole concept of it. There were many more voices that were women or non-binary in the creation of that project, but the project itself was actually one of reclamation. And so this isn't just a D&D thing. This is a fantasy and myth thing. Much fantasy and myth, particularly Western fantasy and myth, although it's not exclusively Western, um, took femininity and made it monstrous. So the general theme of that story is taking these monsters that were really expressions of femininity and reclaiming them again as representations of femininity instead of monsters. And so they took creatures out of the monster manual in D&D, like harpies, Medusa, I'm trying to think. There's so many, but they took these monsters and said no, we're going to reclaim these as parts of our feminine identity. Hags are another good example. Yeah, so it was a wonderful project. There were 3 books, I want to say, maybe there were 4 in that anthology. You can get them on dmskill.com if anybody's interested in it. I know a lot of the talented people that went to writing and curating that collection and supporting them so that we get more representations like that would be awesome. So if you're watching, just saying.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that like I knew what that was and then that you knew as well. Like that says something to me that like both of us being in the community, like we just knew what this awesome representative collection was, and that just makes
Mhm.
me like really uh, really happy. Words are hard. Um, so on the answer of no, we don't, or no, you do not think that there is enough representation. What do you think? What are things that you think need to be done to improve the representation?
Um, so there are a number of things that we can do as a community. The first one I'm going to say is we need to give voice to, to people who have been underrepresented in our community. And so we need to find ways specifically to give creative voice and oversight voice to women, to people of color, to sexual and gender minorities, to religious and ethnic minorities. We need to find ways to offer not only the storytelling, which will make the adventures more sensitive, but also the oversight, which will make certain that they remain sensitive. and that they won't get taken out in the editorial process. And they also, the management and oversight voices are the ones who decide what stories get told in the first place. So we need to better represent those with less voice in the creative and the managerial aspects of our community. That's something that you can see a lot of groups working very hard to do. I can speak to groups that I work with. I can speak to groups that I'm involved in, where that is very important to us. And it still needs to work its way out there into the not necessarily the creative community, which I feel is far more diverse than it used to be, but the corporate community that's behind it. So the big gaming companies, there's been improvement. They've got a long way to go before a cross section of their companies looks like a cross section of our culture.
Yeah, and when I think of it, like, as far as like Adventures League, I know a lot of the moderators, I'd say the moderators right now, I think it's still kind of split 50-50 between men and women, if I remember correctly, with who left and who stayed. Come here. I know. Cats. But when we go to the Wizards of the Coast side, when you think of all the like really awesome guest speakers that come to conventions and stuff, I believe there's still only really one woman that comes. And I think, isn't that Katie? Her name is, I believe, or Kate?
Well, so Kate Welch.
Yes.
Kate Welch works for them. Shelley Mazanoble works for them. She has some authoring credits under her belt, but it's still vastly male.
Yeah.
Still vastly white male.
Yeah. Which those gentlemen have been in those positions just for so long that they're kind of seated, which I guess that's a whole other conversation for some other time. Okay, so you've kind of touched on it a little bit already, like about having inclusive, loving tables, being very open at your tables. But what else have you kind of done in the community to help these issues, like outside of just kind of when you kind of write your adventures and DM your own tables?
I do things like this. I am not afraid to lend my voice to people who may not have it. I know that my presentation is white cis guy, and that gives me a little bit of a louder voice in these spaces, and so I'm not afraid to use it, even if it ruffles a little bit of feathers. And so I do interviews like this. I do interviews for podcasts and podcasts as well. And I try to lend my voice as much as I can to new and aspiring authors. One thing that I'm very proud of that we do with Deep Summit Charities is we run an annual blind submission adventure writing contest. And we ask for a short writing prompt, which the writers get to own. They maintain control of it. So it's not like they're writing it and they have to turn it over to me. They get to keep it and develop it if they want. But when they submit these, they submit them without name. They just choose a 4-digit number. This is who I am. I'm number 0769, and here's my submission. And those submissions are in that format, looked over by numerous creatives who then select their favorites. And the people who are chosen, they get a chance to write an adventure for our events for that year. And we do it that way because we went in with the philosophical belief that if we take appearance, if we take those sorts of that mindset that we have where we automatically stereotype and segregate and marginalize people, if we take all of that out of the works and we just have a 4-digit number and a story, the best stories rise to the top. And if we're being honest about it, oftentimes those best stories are written by people who haven't had a lot of books, new authors, or women, L plus, people of color. And it's been true statistically. I've gone back and looked at our numbers, and when we do that, you see proportions that actually more closely resemble our society, which is awesome news. Yet what it's saying is that not that these people that are out there right now, that they're the best of what we have. It's that we haven't paid attention to a huge number of people for so long. And if we start paying them attention, those stories will start coming out. So we do that as well. And we encourage other organizations to follow that same model with blind submission contests. Trying to think. So, as you had asked the different sorts of things that I do, I'm going to be hosting with some gentlemen from Canada a new author spotlight, where for business reasons, don't necessarily tie to this, a huge number of adventures dropped at the same time to the DM's Guild. Many of those adventures written by new first-time people, and their contribution, the thing that they poured their time into, their stories are being lost because there's so many coming at the same time, and we're giving them a chance just to, hey, here's 15 minutes on this podcast that's dedicated just to you. Tell us about the story you wrote and why we should run it at our tables. So there's a little bit of that too. And it's also working, the last thing I do is I grease my relationships. I work my relationships with other organizations to encourage them to move towards greater diversity and greater representation. I was involved in the rewriting of the DM's Guild rules to make them more inclusive to telling LGBTQIA+ stories, because the rules that were there weren't being enforced evenly between cis-het adventurers and queer adventurers. The rules weren't being enforced in the same way, and so getting those rules rewritten so that queer stories could be told in the same way that cis-het stories could be told. Working with conventions to get them to add representation to their campaign staff. Not just authors, but the people standing at the front desk. Do they look like a cross section of America? And working to make that happen. That's pretty important to us.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think the new author thing is definitely cool, and especially the numbering system versus the naming system. I remember in college I had done incoming for the college literary journal, and I usually would just skip over the names, but sometimes even I would read it and then go back and look at the name to see, oh, who wrote this kind of thing. And so coming from that kind of perspective where I had that, not necessarily bias, but just that knowledge, I definitely think it would have been different experience reading those stories, or in your case, adventures, without that bias. I think that's a really good model to go off of.
Yeah, it gets back to their powerful studies, and I wish I could remember the names of them, but on employment, where for the same job, identical resumes were submitted. The only change was the name, and you would go from a very ethnically Caucasian sounding name to a very ethnically non-Caucasian sounding name, either a name with Spanish or African American roots, and seeing how less often those names are called back as opposed to the ethnically Caucasian names. So if you work the names out often, you work the bias And so, yeah, we just ask people, don't put any identifying information whatsoever in your story. Just tell your story. Because that's what adventures are. It's just the format for storytelling. It's a story. Just tell your story. Don't put any identifying information in it. And we'll make the decision based just on the quality of the submission. Knowing in my heart of hearts that if we did that, we would end up with a lot more minority representation. So
That makes my heart happy.
it makes me happy too, because I would have felt terrible if I was wrong. I was willing to take that gamble when we put together the contest, and it was right. What I learned was right, that that all stories have merit, and that when you work the bias out, you'll start getting more diverse stories.
Yeah. And we've kind of touched on the community already, but do you feel the community atmosphere on social media, local game stores, and at conventions are welcoming to people who represent these groups? And if not, how do you feel we could possibly improve that?
Okay. So what I would say is I would put it back on the interviewer, and I would say, when you look around a convention, does the appearance of that convention match the general, societal makeup?
So, as we had kind of said before the interview, I did that huge con circuit about 2 years ago. And something I noticed as a woman, there were not many women DMs. And I don't know if that was because women feel they are not welcome to DM, or if that's because they simply just were not volunteering. I'm not sure. I know the organizers I've worked with have never really like stifled me in any way. Um, I have noticed some things like between where I went to a convention for the first time as DM, and then a male that I went with, also his first time, he got a lot more different adventures to run, whereas I got, say he got four different adventures to prep and run, whereas I got two and a lot of mustering jobs. Granted, I volunteered for more mustering, so I'm not going to add that into the equation. But I noticed I got, and they weren't as intense or as important of adventures. I was given, not that CCC, obviously, CCC meaning con-created content written for the conventions, just if people watch and don't know what that means. I was given all of those adventures, whereas this gentleman I had went with, he got AL official content, and he got to run the epic and DM at the epic and stuff like that, whereas I had volunteered for this stuff as well, and I was given the CCC.
Right.
So I kind of feel like that. And one convention in particular, I remember looking around the weekend, and I think I was one of two female DMs. And then again, I'm not sure if that's because women feel stifled or if it's because women just don't feel confident enough. I know when I sit down at a table sometimes, I feel, and obviously I am a younger woman too. I'm in my early 20s. So a lot of these people who are coming to my table are a lot of white cis males in their late 30s, 40s, sometimes 50s. And so they kind of sit down, and I definitely feel the projected attitude of, oh, this little girl's going to DM for us kind of thing. So I definitely always feel that need to justify myself and like prove myself as a DM, which I don't think male DMs or male presenting DMs would probably feel that.
So to piggyback off of what you said, I don't want to diminish the role of mustering. I would much rather see more faces at the HQ desk running the show than I currently see. But that role is important because it's often the person only face somebody sees from convention staff, not their DM. I would hate that all of those positions got relegated to women. However, much like hostessing at a restaurant, which is sort of what it's like to do a mustering job. I would say that my observation is much the same, that when I look out at a gaming floor, I typically do not see the cross-representation of America. And until I do, I'm going to say that we are not doing enough to make our places welcome and opening. Until that happens, then we have not done enough. And if that takes putting explicit policies into place and actively going out and welcoming those communities, and then once they are in our space, going out of our way to make sure that they feel safe and welcome, then yeah, then we're not doing enough. And I don't say that I have the formula to make that happen, and I don't think it's going to change overnight, because I believe if we did take a cross section of the gaming subculture, we wouldn't see a cross section, I think, of America. But I think a lot of that is because we've been gatekeeping minority voices out of our subculture for too long. And so it's going to take a little bit of time and a lot of work to welcome the people that should have been in the hobby in the first place back in. But there are a lot of wonderful people doing the heavy lifting to make that happen. And so they deserve all the praise they can get.
I know for sure something I always do at my tables is in my introductions, I will use my pronouns as you did earlier, because we know that even though I am cis and you were cis, like if someone were in the conversation that did not present as cis, they would feel more confident saying and more confident and comfortable saying their pronouns.
Right. I also ask every player at my table to give me their pronouns and to give me their character's pronouns, because much like in any other fantasy game, even video games, the character that you're playing might not be the same gender or representation as you are, and so I ask for both, and I write them both down. If you can see me do it, I write your name and your pronouns and your character's name and their pronouns, and have that information in front of me the whole time. So I model it and then ask other people to do it, so they realize, oh, it's really not that big a deal to say, what my pronouns are. And for individuals that don't identify as cis, it's a powerful way for them to say, oh, that's the expectation here, is that people are going to honor and respect those things. I also make a very, very deliberate effort to call on individuals from traditional minority groups. If I have young children, older Americans, women, people of color, individuals where they have something on that let me know that they're part of the queer community, I will actively call on them. I don't wait for them to contribute. I will actively give them voice in the adventure, because I feel that that's important. So just to bring a little bit more equity into it, because if I don't do that, I find oftentimes it's your cis white men who talk the whole game, and minority gamers who talk very little. So I would say do not let the opinions of a bunch of gatekeeping older white gamers get in the way of you telling stories, because every time I've heard about games at your table, they've always said what a pleasant, nice, and fun and engaging person you are. So you go ahead and tell your stories. Those older opinions, oh, young girls going to be working their way out, those are going to go away. I promise you that. So go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that wasn't like an emergency or something.
No, it's not.
Okay. And something I also do is, I guess I haven't felt comfortable feeling like I force people to say their pronouns. So I've introduced myself, used the pronouns, and then typically people will follow after. If they don't want to say them, they don't have to. Like I don't. And that's probably just a difference thing. And maybe I'll try it next time, going around saying, hey, what pronouns do we prefer? What are our character pronouns? Usually people give me character pronouns before they'll give me their pronouns, which is interesting sometimes. I always, in my DM kit, I don't know if I still have the little same note card, but I drew It was during Winter Fantasy that one year, or not Winter Fantasy, excuse me. It was Origins that year, and it was during Pride, and Pride actually happened during the convention in
It always does.
yep, in what? Where is
It's
Origins?
in
But in
Columbus, Illinois, and that convention always happens over Father's Day, which is also the exact same weekend that Pride Weekend is on every year.
is that? Or I'm thinking of the one that's in Ohio.
It is Columbus, Ohio.
Oh, Columbus, Ohio. I thought you said Illinois. My
Oh, I
brain
might
went.
have. I might have. You know what? I think I did. No, Columbus,
Okay.
Ohio, Father's Day weekend is the weekend of that convention as well as their Pride weekend.
And it was my first Pride too, so I was very excited. But I drew a little note card that says I am a safe space, and then I drew the heart, and then I put bi pride colors in it because I am a bisexual woman. Um, and I noticed a lot of people were very excited to see that and were very happy, and like they'd read my note card and they'd get very like happy about it. And it made me happy, so I continued to use it even after Pride, because at the end, I had, like, Happy Pride at the bottom, so I just cut off the Happy Pride part and just left the rest of the note card, um, and I just always try and make sure my table, even if it's just my table, is a good, welcoming, happy space, exactly like you said, you know? And I think if we get more DMs to do that, like, for example, my partner is a cis white male, straight, if I can encourage him to do these things as well,
Mhm.
then that's one more person. And if we encourage all of our friends to do that, then it's kind of a spiral. And I think that's, at least at my level where I'm at right now, that's a lot of what I can do, giving voice and saying, "Hey, these are important." I'll go to my local conventions and I'm friends with the organizers and things like that, and I'm like, "Hey, is it okay if I post this in the DM group prior to prior to running the convention that weekend?" And it was very inclusive. I don't. It was last year that I did this, but it was something along the lines of, "Hey, make sure we're being inclusive, being happy, you know, just being very mindful of things." And what's really funny is someone actually retaliated in the comments and said that it was actually more exclusive to do those things. It was, like I said, it was a year ago now, so I can't quite remember everything and what I all said in that message, but it was met with almost all overwhelming support except for that one person. It was just very much like, okay, you're that type of person that's kind of trying to say, well, it doesn't matter. Like, if we just go about our gaming the same old, it's fine. Like, if these people come and sit down, like, that's fine. It's like,
Except if you have the time to sit and query that person and ask them if the people they see at that convention match a cross section of America. Like that, it's not very representative at that point. And so doing nothing isn't enough.
yeah. And I obviously very disagreed with him, and I think ultimately he decided to not come to the convention. And
And that gets back to what I said earlier about seeing the people who don't agree that diversity is important, that they work their way out of our spaces.
yeah, it's like, if you're
I
not
mean,
welcoming, you're not welcome.
welcome. Right.
But I think that's kind of all I had for the interview. Did you have anything you wanted to add, like things on the topic that I didn't bring up?
No, I appreciate a chance to sit and talk, and not just only speak but reflect upon upon my beliefs and the things that a lot of us do in our community to try to make this a better place, for everybody to be a part of it. If you are interested, if you're watching and you're interested in continuing this community, or continuing asking questions or understanding more about this community, I want to invite you, if you would like. You can feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. I'm a very visible person there. My Twitter is the Healer DM, short for Dungeon Master. The Healer DM. Just hit me up there, follow me, and my DMs are open for people who have questions. And I really think I'm really thankful that there are young 20-somethings like you who are taking up the mantle of this hobby and moving us toward a more welcoming and inclusive space. That makes me feel like the things that old guys have done, the things that we're doing are really mattering. So thank you.
No, thank you.